Carnegie and Frick now controlled their labor costs everywhere, except at Homestead, where the Amalgamated was entrenched. They had introduced the most modern machinery and technology at Homestead. The mill now required fewer workers, and the skills needed were not the obsolete skills of the old craftsmen, the puddlers. Yet it was these craftsmen who ran the union, and, unlike Carnegie's non-union mills, had a say in who was hired and how the work was done. No one believed more in the union cause than Homestead's activist mayor, John McLuckie.
John McLuckie and his associates in Homestead believed above all in the idea that all American workers should be entitled to a job, a livelihood, and to having a sufficiency of means for living comfortably. They believed that this was an essential American right, and that individuals such as Carnegie couldn't be allowed to continue to accumulate wealth unfettered, untrammeled, and that the power, the wealth that the Homestead Steelworks represented, and the power and wealth that Carnegie had over the lives of ordinary workers such as McLuckie and his associates was tyranny. It was a step backward, not a step forward.
In the spring of 1892, Carnegie had Frick roll as much armor plate as possible before the union's contract expired at the end of June. America's largest steel producer had decided to eliminate America's largest craft union. How they would do it was still uncertain. Carnegie departed for his usual lengthy vacation, but this year at Lochrannoch, in the remote Scottish Highlands. Better that a champion of unions about to crush one be inaccessible to the press. If Frick's terms were not accepted, Carnegie instructed him to close the plant and wait the men out. Later, he gave Frick more leeway. "We approve of anything you do," he wrote from England. "We are with you to the end." What Frick did was build a fence 3 miles long and 11 feet high around the entire plant. The workers called it Fort Frick. On June 25th, Frick announced the company would no longer negotiate with the union, but only with workers individually. Leaders of the Amalgamated were willing to concede on every issue to save their union. They tried to reach Carnegie in Scotland, the Carnegie who took no man's job, but could not find him. "This is your chance to reorganize the whole affair," Carnegie wrote Frick. "Exact good reasons for employing every man. Far too many men required by amalgamated rules. Carnegie did not believe there would be much of a struggle. He gambled the workers would rather keep their jobs than their union. But they stood firm. At the end of June, Frick began closing down his open hearth and armor plate mills. He locked out 1,100 men. On July 1st, the remaining 2,400 went on strike. The furnaces that roared like 100 lions were quiet. The mills that thundered like cannon were still. Frick planned to open on July 6th and replace union workers with a non-union
The workers believed because they had worked in the mill, they had mixed their labor with the property in the mill, they believed that in some way that property had become theirs. Not that it wasn't Andrew Carnegie's, not that they were the sole proprietors of the mill, but that they had an entitlement in the mill. And I think in a fundamental way, the conflict at Homestead in 1892 was about these two conflicting views of property. But it also was about American rights.
Journalists flocked to Homestead from across the country. Carnegie's plants represented the future of industrial America. At stake was what role unions would play. Frick requested the sheriff to post notices saying that he intended to protect the mill. The workers tore them down. He knew the sheriff could not protect the mill, but Pinkerton guards had never failed him. Once again, Frick called upon industrial America's hired guns. Early in the morning of July 6th, tugboats pulled two barges with 300 armed Pinkertons slowly up the Monongahela toward Homestead. The town stood solidly behind Mayor McLucky. "We do not propose that Andrew Carnegie's representatives shall bulldoze us," he told the workers. "We have our homes in this town. We have our churches here and our cemeteries. We are bound to Homestead by all the ties that men hold dearest and most sacred. The Carnegie Company has imported men of all nationalities in other places. They have never imported a man into Homestead, and they never will." It was daylight in Scotland. Carnegie returned to the Central Highlands from nearby Aberdeen, where he had dedicated a library to wild applause. He was eager to test a new fly in the trout streams. Union lookouts were at their posts along the Monongahela. A Pittsburgh journalist wrote that at about 3 a.m., a horseman riding at breakneck speed dashed into the streets of Homestead, giving the alarm as he sped along. Men, women, and children burst from their homes and rushed to the banks of the Monongahela. "It is evident there is no bluffing at Homestead," the New York Times had observed. "The fight there is to be to the death." Shortly before sunrise, the barges landed near the pump house. Workers begged the Pinkertons not to come ashore. Armed with Winchesters and pistols, the Pinkertons ignored them. No one knows who fired the first shot. For nearly 14 hours, workers and Pinkertons traded gunfire. The strikers set a freight car on fire and rolled it down the tracks at the barges. They tried dynamite and pumped oil into the river to set it on fire. the Pinkertons surrendered at 4 p.m., 3 detectives and 9 workers were dead or dying. But the workers had won the battle. Then they began to lose the war. Union leaders promised safe passage but could not control the mob. Enraged workers and their wives made the Pinkertons run the gauntlet. The men screamed for mercy, the New York World wrote. They were beaten over the head with clubs and the butt ends of rifles. You could almost hear the skulls crack. And when they finally escaped, it was with blood in streams rushing down the backs of their heads. After the surrender, the barges were set aflame. The Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette reported, "Twilight now being about ended, the entire riverfront was lit up, while 2,000 throats shouted, 'Hooray for Homestead!'" Carnegie cabled Frick from Scotland, "Never employ one of these rioters. Let grass grow over works, must not fail now." But in a letter to his cousin George Lauder, he was critical of Frick.
He indicated that to him, part of the tragedy was due simply to the stupidity with which the preparations for the battle had been handled. In other words, he was accusing Frick of bad generalship in this, not so much accusing him of bad morals and principles in fighting the battle.
At Homestead, the workers continued to protect the plant, what they thought was their plant. They were certain the Pinkertons would be arrested, surprised when they were put on a night train for their protection. When the workers refused to surrender the plant to the sheriff, the governor of Pennsylvania sent the militia to reclaim the mill for Carnegie Steel. Frick brought in strikebreakers to reopen the works. The strikers' fortunes suffered another blow when Alexander Berkman, a Russian anarchist, unconnected to the Union, tried to assassinate Frick on behalf of the working people. He fired 2 bullets into Frick's neck and stabbed him 3 times.
After Berkman's attack, a carpenter was on top of Berkman, and he had a hammer in his hand, and he was going to bash Berkman's head in. And my great-grandfather said, and at this point he's got the 2 bullet wounds in his neck, he's really bleeding to death, and knife wounds, blood all over the floor and down his legs. He says to the carpenter, "Don't hit him, leave him to the law. Don't hit him, leave him to the law." So they take Berkman away. In the meantime, my great-grandfather suddenly got up from his desk. This was after the surgeons had dug the bullets out without any anesthesia. Then he gets up and he goes back to his desk and he completes his entire day's work and business. Writes Carnegie, "Don't bother, don't come home. We'll fight the strike out even if it kills me."
Carnegie had won his victory, but at a huge price. His image as a radical reformer, so carefully cultivated, was in shambles. A congressman from Ohio called him the arch sneak of this age. The Edinburgh Dispatch bewailed the strike-breaking methods which prevailed in the land of triumphant democracy. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch editorialized, 10,000 Carnegie public libraries would not compensate the country for the direct and indirect evils resulting from the Homestead lockout. Say what you will of Frick, he is a brave man. Say what you will of Carnegie, he is a coward, and gods and men hate cowards.
It's easy to say that Carnegie was a hypocrite. There is an element of hypocrisy clearly in between what he said and what was done. But it's a little too easy to simply dismiss the whole incident on Carnegie's part as an act of hypocrisy. There is this curious reason as to why Carnegie felt it necessary to ever enunciate the rights of labor. Frick was the norm, not Carnegie, in management's relationship with labor at that time. And one can only answer it that, once again, it's this being torn between wanting to pose as a great Democrat and liberal, and at the same time wanting to make sure Carnegie Steel came out on top.
As Christmas approached, 1,800 men were out of work. Their leaders would be blackballed in the steel industry for the rest of their lives. There would be no steel workers' union for 45 years. They lost their jobs, their homes, everything. Hungry men and their families had to stand outside the plant and watch what the Pittsburgh press called a lost paradise. If you look forward to a happy Christmas, not having put forth a helping hand, your turkey ought to choke you.